So our guests are just arriving. We're very glad you're here this evening. Hi, my name is Doug Farley. I'm the director at the Cobblestone Museum, and we're glad that you chose to take in this program tonight. It's going to be a very interesting program. We're very thankful for our speaker, Ben Kemp. And throughout the course of this presentation, we asked you to keep your microphones muted. If you haven't done that already, please mute your microphones. We'll be glad to take questions throughout the presentation using the chat feature, but please don't unmute your microphones until the end of the evening. Put your questions in the chat box, and then we'll review those at the end of the presentation with Ben. And then at the very end of the evening, you're welcome to unmute your microphones and converse directly with Ben if you would like. So that having been said, thank you again for participating here with the Cobblestone Museum. We look forward to your visit, possibly this summer. We have 10 buildings on our campus, which we interpret, and we'd love to be able to show you the Cobblestone National Historic Landmark District. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, oh yes, and we are making a recording this evening. The recording will be available to you after this presentation, and we'll make that available. Just email us once again and let us know that you'd like the link, and we'll be glad to send you that. And if you know someone else who wasn't able to participate this evening, but you think they'd like to see it, they can continue to get the link the same way that you did to arrive this evening. So just let us know, tell them to look at our website and make that accommodation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sue Bonafini, our Assistant Director at the Cobblestone Museum. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Doug. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to hear our speaker, Ben Kemp, who is the Operations Manager at the Ulysses S. Grant Cottage State Historic Site. And he is going to present The Greatest Act, Ulysses S. Grant, and Civil Rights. Tonight's program is sponsored by Pat's Auto Repair in Albion, New York. And we are very grateful to owners Patrick and Marissa for their support of our virtual programming this year for the presentations scheduled in both February and March. Thank you to each of you in our virtual audience for your support of the Cobblestone Society and Museum. We truly appreciate all of your registrations, donations at any level, especially if you chose an option that provides greater funding. I want to say hello to those of you who are joining us again because you have been with us for past presentations, and I want to welcome those who are first-time viewers. Now, viewers from several states are with us, so if you have your camera turned on, feel free to share a wave with Speaker Ben as I shout out where you're calling in from. We have guests tonight, Ben joining us from Michigan, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. Now, again, if you are newly acquainted with us, as Doug said, we have 10 buildings at our museum. We give tours through 8 of our buildings, 3 which are Cobblestone National Historic Landmark structures. We have 2 additional buildings that house our current self-guiding exhibits. One, a 19th century coverlet display that has over 20 woven historic textiles. And we have a Victorian mourning art and sundries display of over 200 examples of objects and images, which are on loan from our retired museum curator and director, Bill Lattin. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Tonight's speaker was born and raised in the Saratoga region of New York State. He is a living historian, speaker, and researcher who has been featured on C-SPAN, PBS, the National Park Service, and the 2020 History Channel documentary Grant. Ben has been a staff member at Grant Cottage State Historic Site, which is a National Historic Landmark, since 2014. His research into Grant has been primarily focused on the lesser-known personal life and forgotten legacy of U.S. Grant. This research has revealed a relatable figure and fostered a fresh appreciation for the man who saved the Union. Ben has published numerous articles related to Grant, and he is a contributor to the book Grant at 200, Reconsidering the Life and Legacy of Ulysses S. Grant. Ben is willing to sign copies of Grant at 200 for anyone in attendance this evening who would like to purchase one through the Grant Cottage online store. You can ask him about this when we get an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. Again, feel free to put questions into the chat feature, which I will monitor throughout the program. So Ben, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Sue. I'm so excited to be here this evening with everyone virtually, but I want to thank you and Doug, of course, and I certainly appreciate what it takes to put these programs on, even the virtual ones, because I'm on the program committee of two different nonprofits. So I definitely want to thank you as well for putting this all together so that we can discuss this interesting aspect of Grant's legacy that's mostly overlooked. I think as an interesting practice, I just thought of this. If everyone would be willing to do this, anyone who would like to, when I say the word civil rights and president, I'd like you to go ahead and put in the chat the president or presidents that come to mind. And we can circle back around to that towards the end. So, my three goals in researching Grant and civil rights, his relationship to civil rights. And when I say civil rights, there are two different periods. And the first period is a little less known and studied. The second period is very well known. It's much more recent. You're talking about the 50s and the 60s of the 20th century and the civil rights legislation that occurred then. But there is this earlier era that people have some concept of, but really don't understand it quite as well. It's a little further back in history. There was, some things that happened in between. It wasn't a smooth set of progress. So I made it the three goals, the three things I was looking at in this research was to, number one, better understand Grant's role in the 60s era of the first civil rights era of the United States in the 1860s and 70s. The second part was kind of on a more personal level, to better understand him and his thinking, to investigate his evolution on the subject of civil rights and slavery in particular. And then number three, what were the long-term effects? What were the effects after he left office? What were the effects after he died? What are the effects today that still affect us today? And so those are the three basic things that will be woven into tonight's presentation. So we're going to start that. Because of that, we're going to start kind of right in the beginning. And hopefully this works. There we are. And so in the beginning, Grant was actually born in the very, very far southern tip of Ohio, bordering Kentucky and across the Ohio River. And so he was born right on the river. And then when he was an infant, they moved him inland a little bit, but he was still very, very close to Kentucky, which was at the time a slave state in the 1820s and 30s as he was growing up. And Ohio, of course, was a free state. Now, in his personal family, you have his father, Jesse Root Grant, who you can see the image of. Jesse was fairly outspoken. He was public anyway. He published things in the local papers. He was anti-slavery. Now, I say that term, specifically anti-slavery because in that time, abolitionist had a different meaning than just anti-slavery or anti-slavery expansion. So there was a spectrum of anti-slavery. And so that's really important going forward to understand that. In my research, I had to understand the mentality of someone from that era, the terminology they were using, and so that's something. When Jesse Root Grant is usually labeled an abolitionist, but when you really research it, you really don't see him uh, as an abolitionist. Um, Grant had family on both sides of the border, I should say, of slavery and free states. He had quite a few cousins and relatives in Kentucky and Virginia, slave states, and so he was certainly he was certainly exposed to slavery. Um, and just to prove the point of how divided this area was that he grew up in, he said right before the war that there were in his community on the free side of Ohio, there were churches that were, it said, to secure membership, hostility to the government, to the war, and to the liberation of the slaves was far more essential than belief in the Bible. He was making quite a statement there. He's saying that they're preaching pro-slavery in churches in Ohio. And so, that just shows how divided the community was prior to the Civil War and right up to it. Now, when he was a young man, he went to school on both sides of the river. You can see a picture of a very prominent abolitionist from the time, Reverend John Rankin, and he's actually going to be part of the Underground Railroad, very active. He's got a home right in Ripley, Ohio, that's a national landmark. And but he was the man who ran the school that Grant went to on that side, but he also went to Maysville. You can see that marked on the map. Maysville, Kentucky, across the river. He went there as well. Grant also had an uncle that was a full abolitionist over in Kentucky, living in Kentucky. That wasn't the safest thing at the time to be an abolitionist in Kentucky. Jesse's criticism of his family that owned slaves was that they basically were lazy and not self-sufficient because they had to rely on slave labor. Grant himself, as a child and growing up to his teen years, you really don't see. There's nothing in the record that indicates his personal belief. People assume that because of his father's beliefs that he would necessarily take after that, but that's not always the case in these situations. Grant was a fairly independent individual in a lot of things in his life. So he did seem to side with his father on, in terms of the, politically being a Whig is what he ended up becoming, which was against the expansion of slavery. So again, the idea it wasn't, and interestingly enough, Jesse Root Grant spent time living with John Brown and John Brown's father in northern Ohio for a while when he was growing up. And so, but later on, they would both say John Brown, had a righteous cause, but he was a man that was crazed or fanatic in what he was doing. And so, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So one of the most important things in order for Grant to have any, concern or passion or drive, towards civil rights or towards the humane treatment of people of all different races and religions, was a general sensitivity to oppression and injustice. And we see that at a very early age with Grant. In the Mexican War, he says he later said he was bitterly opposed to the war. Now he's gone to West Point Military School. He's still very young. He's being sent to the Mexican War, and he said afterwards that he thought it was an unjust war and actually a conspiracy to acquire more slave states or slave state territory. And again, so a shameless bid to expand slavery, and kind of indicates that he was never a fan of expansion, slavery expansion. Again, that's different than just the institution of slavery. We'll get to that later. But he also, as he's down there, he sees the inequality. He sees that, in his words, the better class of Mexicans are very proud and tyrannize over the lower and much more numerous class, as much as a hard master does over his Negroes, and they submit to it quite as humbly. So I think, again, he's making that comparison and saying that it is tyranny. So he's equating tyranny to the institution of slavery. Again, you kind of have to look into these statements because he doesn't say a lot directly about slavery prior to the Civil War at all. So he also recognizes and sympathizes with the plight of the Native Americans when he's later stationed after the Mexican War on the west coast of the United States, specifically the Northwest. And he says that even this poor remnant of a once powerful tribe is fast wasting away before those blessings of civilization, whiskey and smallpox. So he's understanding. He's very, very observant, and seems to be able to look at things without the lens of prejudice that was so common in that era. So we start to see that. Now, when Grant comes back from the Mexican War, he actually has essentially an indentured servant with him, a young Mexican boy named Gregario. The difference is that he may not be, paying him in funds. We don't know for sure, but he was definitely, gave him, paid for his passage to the United States for better opportunities. And so we do know that he was compensated for what he was doing. And he worked for him for just a short time as a valet before he went on to other things. So I think that's really going to be a guiding force, his sensitivity to oppression and injustice. So one of the things we see come out in Grant is that he's got certain priorities. People weren't ignorant of the Civil War coming in the antebellum America. They saw it. The writing was on the wall. And Grant, when he's in St. Louis, he married Julia Grant, who was Julia Dent, who was from a slave plantation outside of St. Louis, and he married her. And when he left the army in the 1850s, he went and lived on the plantation with his in-laws and his wife. And they started having children there. Now, as it gets closer to the Civil War, there is an election. In this case, it was James Buchanan was running for president, and that's who Grant voted for. Now, he was a Democrat. And you would say, well, if Grant is, anti-slavery, anti-expansion, as it shows in this political cartoon from much later on, they're accusing Grant of voting for slavery expansion. Well, Grant says himself multiple times in his life, he actually explains this vote and why he did it. And he says, while with a Democrat elected by the unanimous vote of the slave states, there could be no pretext for secession for 4 years. Again, delaying the inevitable. I very much hope that the passions of the people would subside in that time and the catastrophe could be averted altogether. If it was not, I believe the country would be better prepared to receive the shock and resist it. Therefore, I voted for James Buchanan. And as I mentioned earlier, there's another quote there about how him and his father had a distaste for extremists, what they called at the time abolitionists. That was actually a term of derision to moderates at the time. And so they because they saw them as agitators, as people that would stop them from being able to find a peaceful or a gradual end to slavery, which was a very prominent, and even in the anti-slavery movement, that was pretty prominent, that they wanted to see a gradual emancipation situation. And so just so you understand a little bit more about where Grant's mentality was at the time, he wanted to preserve the Union. We're going to talk about that again. Preserving the Union, he thought, was the primary concern. Slavery was a secondary thing to be dealt with, but obviously, if the nation broke apart and destabilized, that would be worse for everybody, no matter what, in his mind. So you have the Fugitive Slave Act 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854, the Dred Scott decision in 1857. These are all things that are going to really solidify the fact that, this is getting worse. And this is becoming an issue that Northerners can't ignore, and Northerners aren't going to be able to agree on. So that's the kind of situation Grant is dealing with at that time in general. Um, so there isn't a lot of evidence how Grant interacted with slavery when he was at his wife's plantation for, I think it was 8 years prior to the Civil War. They had about 30 enslaved people there at one time on the plantation of his father-in-law. Um, there is evidence that Grant was not morally comfortable with the institution of slavery. He did not agree with this institution of slavery. He says that later on in his life. Um, but he did participate in to some extent in slavery, in the institution of slavery. Um, he didn't desire to perpetuate it either. That will come out as well. So Julia's sister, says she was young at the time, but she says Grant was opposed to human slavery as an institution, but I do not think Grant was such a rank abolitionist that Julia's slaves had to be forced upon him. Emma Dent. And so what that means is Julia was given a few enslaved individuals to work for, or to be her kind of personal servants from her father-in-law. There's no real evidence that she technically owned them, but that's a whole nother story. But Grant was given the services of an enslaved individual named William Jones when him and his wife were given a piece of land on the property to clear and farm themselves from his father-in-law, Frederick Dent. And so he's got William Jones there. He's got a couple of other hired enslaved individuals, I believe freed black individuals as well at the time. And so he is trying to make the go at farming there. And he works right alongside them. Everybody says he can't manage them. He won't whip them. He won't, he's not cut out, which I guess is the compliment I would say for the institution of slavery. So we don't know why, but it's a very powerful moment. What you see an image of here is, I was able to visit this when I went out to St. Louis. This is the courthouse, the old courthouse, they call it. It's more or less a museum inside now, I believe. I wasn't able to go in, but it's where the Dred Scott decision happened in 1857. So 2 years later, who walks in the door but Grant with this enslaved individual, William Jones, and he signs off on his freedom. We don't know. People say it's a statement about that Grant's making, but we don't really know. Maybe William Jones was ill. We don't know, but we do know that Grant, if he was well, he would have been a valuable slave in terms of his value. And so we do know that Grant did not, who could have certainly used the funds, did not choose to sell him. And later on, you do find that Grant is avoiding any of the slaves from the plantation being sold at the auction block. So that's something that I think was incredibly distasteful about the institution of Grant. He mentions it on a few occasions. So he frees William Jones in 1859, right before the Civil War. And not too long after, they leave the other slaves behind because they're moving north to Galena, Illinois, for some opportunities that Grant's father, Jesse Grant, has given him in a leather store he owns up there. And so, and again, you see Grant finding positions for these other enslaved individuals in St. Louis so they don't get, you've heard the term, sent down the river, which meant going to potentially and probably worse conditions in the further south. So another thing to remember is that not all anti-slavery people that held anti-slavery beliefs necessarily believed in equality of the races. That's another thing to be clear about. And so some later statements Grant makes definitely lends you to believe that he doesn't have that prejudice that's very prevalent in both the North and the South at the time about the inequality of the races. and the I would say the inferiority of the black race according to that prejudiced view. So we get into there we are. So Grant, the Civil War is breaking out, and Grant is um, looking at the institution of slavery immediately. And I think he kind of has to because his father-in-law has enslaved individuals. So he's kind of writing to him in one of the letters, and then he's writing to his father. And he's really saying, this is the situation. They didn't the call for troops was to preserve the Union. That's why most soldiers joined the Union forces in the Civil War. It was not to emancipate uh, the slaves. So Grant, that's where Grant's mindset is as well. He says to his father-in-law, in all of this, that this is right after the war starts, just days after Fort Sumter, really. In all this, I can see but the doom of slavery. The North do not want, nor will they want to interfere with the institution, but they will refuse for all time to give it protection unless the South shall return soon to their allegiance. And again, it's important to read this in what is in Grant's mind at the time is that preservation of the Union is priority. And so he's not saying that slavery shouldn't be eventually, abolished. He's just saying we need to preserve the Union now. And so the Northerners don't want to interfere with the institution, which was actually a pretty widely held belief at the time. He says it again to his father with a little extra, in there. He says Negroes will depreciate so rapidly in value that nobody will want to own them. The N-word will never disturb this country again. The worst that is, he may revolt and cause more destruction than any Northern man, except it be the ultra abolitionist wants to see. And again, we have to really understand what he's saying here. I put that in here. It's a challenging statement by Grant. Is use of the N-word in this context really, because he uses the word Negro as well, is really, I believe, has to do with the fact that he was living in the South, he was living in St. Louis, and he was more playing off, I believe, the pejorative that they used at the time. So he's saying that in terms of a slave revolt, in terms of the question, that's weighing on the Southerners and their fear of this pejorative. And that's the idea that he's also calling out ultra abolitionists as agitators that are making things worse. He says in another statement, he says, I blame them. I blame them for making this worse. But he does get to the point, of course, where even by the end of 1861, where he says, if it is necessary that slavery should fall, that the republic may continue its existence, let slavery go. So he's making that clear. Preservation of the Union is number one, but if slavery has to go to make that happen, it will become a goal of the war aim. And you got to understand, he's listening to people in St. Louis talking about, secession as though it was nothing but a tariff bill. And it said it made his blood run cold. So he's hearing this, and he said, I would leave the country if there was a successful break. He said, wouldn't even want to be a part of a country that broke up. So that's how important the Union was to him. So you get into the Civil War, the early part, and you end up with a situation arises. So some enslaved individuals end up at a fort in Virginia, and they ran away from Confederate lines. So they were working for the Confederate military. And General Butler is there, Benjamin Butler, who was a lawyer before the war, and he actually came up with a pretty clever legal premise. He said that if the Southerners consider them property and the Southerners are no longer U.S. citizens because they've seceded, then we can take your property as contraband of war. And so that's where the term contraband came from. So it was a way to allow them to be received into Union lines as refugees, essentially. And they did put them to work, but they did pay them, obviously. And that's a contraband camp in Virginia that you're seeing on the screen. Now, Grant employed, once this occurred, obviously, many, many enslaved individuals fled when the Union Army was close by, no matter where they were, in the West, in the South, wherever they were. and they ran to Union lines. And he puts Chaplain John Eaton in you know charge of setting up these refugee camps, but he wanted it done so humanely. He wanted to make sure there was education immediately, that there was, the supplies they needed. If they wanted to work for the military, they could. If they wanted to just grow vegetables and just subsist, they could. So he says, never before, this is Eaton talking about it later, never before in those early days of the war had I heard the issue of the problem of the Negro attacked so vigorously and with such humanity combined with practical good sense. So, Grant really had a humane, policy from the very beginning. Um, he also takes actions to, dispel racial stereotypes that influence public opinion against Black freedom and advancement at this very early stage. Um, and again, a humane and a fair treatment is what he encouraged. He encouraged the slave owners in the areas that he occupied militarily to pay the enslaved individuals that were still on the plantation. That's what he was working towards. Now, Grant says something really interesting, and again, this is where I was talking about it earlier. He says, "I was never what could be called an abolitionist, not even what could be called anti-slavery, but I try to judge fairly and honestly, and it became patent in my mind early in the rebellion that the North and South could never be at peace with each other except as one nation, and that without slavery." So, and so he's saying this about 8 months after the Emancipation Proclamation comes out. And that says all persons held as slaves within designated states, which is southern states, not the border states, henceforward shall be free. Such persons, suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. And so, but the justification that Lincoln had was the same that Grant had in his mind at first, and that was military necessity. That it wasn't purely abolition at the time. It was taking away that workforce and taking away that military tool from the South. And again, Grant saying he was an abolitionist, that's easy to explain. That he saw them as extremists that were agitators. And then anti-slavery. And again, it's interesting what could be called anti-slavery. I think Grant again is really assigning that word to something a little bit more severe than just a person who's not comfortable with the institution of slavery. So Grant goes a step further when African Americans are allowed to serve in the military. They were only doing camp work before that, but to actually put a uniform on, serve as a soldier, and so it was very controversial, even in the especially in the North, because of prejudice. But Grant had an incredible ability to adapt to circumstances. So he's going to advocate specifically for African American enlistment for them to be able to serve. And he says to Lincoln, he says, "I have given the subject of arming the Negro my hearty support. This, with the emancipation of the Negro, is the heaviest blow yet given the Confederacy. By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally." And he says they will make good soldiers. And that's a powerful statement. A lot of people were saying they would never be able to be good soldiers. That was a very prevalent. And so he's going to go above and beyond that. He's actually going to take action to ensure equal treatment for Black soldiers. He was especially horrified by the ordeal that happened at Fort Pillow, where there was a massacre, a horrible massacre of prisoners of war that were Black at the time. And he would not tolerate that mistreatment. And the prisoners exchange system that they had with the Confederacy broke down because the Confederates wouldn't agree to treating African American soldiers as soldiers. And so Grant really did stick to his guns there. He said in one letter, he said, "It is expected that all commanders will especially exert themselves in carrying out the policy of this administration, not only in organizing colored regiments and rendering them efficient, but also in removing prejudices against them." So, I mean, that's pretty incredible. And 200,000 African American soldiers served, and 40,000 of them died. They played an incredible role, even though they started a little bit later in the war. oops, let's get back to where we're supposed to be. There we are. And so we have Frederick Douglass chiming in a little bit later about, Grant in the war. He says, with General Grant, there was a moral as well as a military basis for my faith in him. He had shown his single-mindedness and superiority to popular prejudice by his prompt cooperation with President Lincoln in employing colored troops and his order commanding his soldiers to treat him with respect. In this way, he proved himself not to be only a wise general, but a great man, one who could adjust himself to new conditions and adopt the lessons taught by the events of the hour. And most people would agree Frederick Douglass was a pretty perceptive individual. And so, I think that's a glowing recommendation, commendation of Grant. We also have the Freedmen's Bureau, which kind of starts up kind of as the outgrowth of this taking care of the refugees during the war. So the war is coming to a close. We still have to take care of them in some way. They need care. And so Grant advocates for the Freedmen's Bureau, which that's their job, to make sure that their rights are protected. And he says something very interesting in this statement where he's advocating for this Freedmen's Bureau. He says it cannot be expected that the opinions held by the men of the South for years can be changed in a day. I mean, it's a bit of an understatement, but they're not going to accept racial equality. They're not even going to accept the rights given to African Americans. And so he says, therefore, freedmen require for a few years not only laws, but fostering care, including good counsel. Obviously, it included schools and food and things to get them by as they establish themselves in a difficult situation. So post-war, prior to his presidency, and Grant did have a long-term vision. He even at that time he was saying, it will be enfranchisement eventually. Citizenship was in the 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War. He kind of had an idea that suffrage should be held off for a while, allow them to establish themselves and gain an education, and then they can be informed voters. So he thought it should be that, and there should be military rule for a while, which there was. But the reason he became a little bit more radical is what they called them at the time, radical republicanism at the time during what we call Reconstruction, is because of, well, Lincoln was shot and his successor was his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner who was a Union man, but he was also a white supremacist. So it didn't work well for the civil rights part of Reconstruction. In fact, Andrew Johnson in those years after the war just butted heads with Congress, and very little got accomplished that should have been during that time. And Grant sees this, and he's part of it. He's the general of all the armies at the time, and he sees this dysfunction. He gets wrapped into it. He's even involved in the impeachment of Johnson, which is unsuccessful. So it's this, Grant sees the gains of the war, which included emancipation and rights for the African Americans. He sees that slipping away under this dysfunction in the government. He even says, I didn't think that most of the Northern people, he said, weren't in favor of immediate, Negro suffrage. They again, as I said before, there should have been some time, he thought, but he came to the point where he says it became necessary to enfranchise the Negro sooner in all his ignorance, and he gradually worked himself up to favoring that immediate enfranchisement because of all this stuff that was going on. They needed a voice at that time. Because again, to be clear, Grant had no personal aspirations. He did not want to get involved in politics. He would have been better off financially to stay as a general. He would have been better off mentally, psychologically to stay as a general. So even though he was part of Reconstruction, in the early Reconstruction period, as a general, he did have to, oversee the stability of the South and the military rule of some of the southern states. But he didn't have the pressure of what the presidency brings necessarily. And so he didn't want it. But again, he was pressured into it. He said, we can't leave this up to mere trading politicians. We have to secure the gains that so many sacrificed for. And so that's where he's going to move into the presidency. Again, in spite of myself, he even said that. He took the presidency in 1868. He was elected 1869. He takes over. He became a radical, aligned with the radical Republicans during that time. He was a Republican candidate, but he became more and more so as things went along because he more and more was. It was apparent that the Democrats were they had their party platform was white supremacy and subduing and subverting the rights of the African Americans in the South especially. And so that was something that he was committed to working against, kind of the opposite of Johnson, to be honest with you. And so he one of his first things he champions immediately, they had passed the 15th Amendment, voting rights for African American men, but they had not ratified it. But he went around twisting arms to get that ratified early, and that's a pretty big thing to do early in your first term, and that's what he did. And by early 1870, he was signing what he thought was the greatest act of the nation since its founding. He said 4 million people are voters who weren't even citizens before. And he said it's the most important act. It's the biggest change in our in our nation. And so he's also saying withhold no legal privilege to advancement. He really champions this. He really celebrates this as being a major step. So he has something else that he champions early in his term, and that's he's trying to annex Santo Domingo, which is now known as the Dominican Republic, island in the Caribbean. And most people kind of have an incorrect assessment of this. They say, "Oh well, Grant was just like Lincoln. Lincoln wanted to send all the enslaved individuals back to Africa or Liberia, whatever it was." This was different, and I'll tell you why. Because one, the people of Santo Domingo, Grant wasn't going to annex Santo Domingo without their consent, without the consent of the people themselves. It wasn't going to be a hostile takeover. It wasn't going to be what we think of as imperialism. That wasn't his intent. Now, what he did want it to become was a bargaining chip for African Americans in the South. They could go to this place where it would be a state of the union. They could be a citizen still, but they could go there, or they could just threaten their employer or their employers, probably ex-masters at one time, because they weren't being treated well. So he's giving them some leverage on that to get better treatment. He says caste has no foothold, is capable of supporting the entire colored population in the United States if they choose to emigrate. The present difficulty in bringing all parts of the United States to a happy unity and love of country grows out of the prejudice to color. The prejudice is a senseless one, but it exists. And that was not a popular statement in that time. The colored man cannot be spared until his place is supplied, but with a refuge like Santo Domingo, his worth here would soon be discovered, and he'd be able to get essentially proper treatment. And so that's what Santo Domingo. He was ultimately unsuccessful, but he tried twice. That was one of his failures. He actually had a lot of success in his presidency, but that was one of his failures, and he actually regretted that. He really thought it would be a good thing for the African Americans. And in addition, we find out that Grant abhors slavery around the world because he puts into this whole plan that if there's a free Santo Domingo, that will help eliminate slavery in nearby Puerto Rico and Cuba, just by the fact that they'll all just go to Santo Domingo, to get, and so he definitely wanted to see slavery end. He made statements around the world, Brazil, other places that still had it at the time, because America was sponsoring it by buying goods from there. Couldn't get away from it. Oops. So Grant is going to have to fight a second war. The second war is against the what's called the White Leagues, better known as the most well-known one, well-organized, was the Ku Klux Klan. And Grant, this is a whole nother war because this is what we would consider an insurgency, a domestic terrorism organization, and it was the largest one our nation's ever seen. So Grant used the power of the pen and persuasion to take them out. He said at one point, the spirit of hatred and violence is greater than law. What he meant by that is there's so many members of the KKK in certain areas of the South that they couldn't bring anyone to justice. The judges were KKK members, the juries were KKK members, and they would just toss cases out of court, even murders. And so Grant brought in federal power. He lobbied Congress. He got the Klan Acts passed. He got other rights or civil rights acts passed. But basically, he made sure he could use federal forces, and this is unprecedented at the time, to guarantee civil rights for the formerly enslaved in the South. And so he's sending in troops where he has to. He doesn't want to do it too much, but it gets to the point where he has to break the back of the Klan, and the only way to do that is to prosecute. They have to bring juries in from out of state, jurors in from out of state, just to make it work. And what does he create during this time? The Department of Justice to do this. And so these incredible milestones of prosecuting racial violence, racially fueled violence, political violence as well. And so that's again, I'm not going to go deep into it. We don't have time, but I would recommend the book Klan War by Fergus Bordewick. Very recent book, very, very, very excellent take on it. Hard to read. It has some very disturbing content in it because the era was very disturbing, but I think it's done tastefully, and I would recommend that book to go into that. Now, he wants to create a situation where there's a fair chance for African Americans. He says the effects, this is in 1873 when he's taking office for the second time. He says the effects of the late civil strife have been to free the slave, make him a citizen, yet he's not possessed the civil rights which citizenship should carry with it. It's wrong, it should be corrected, and to this correction I stand committed. And then he goes on to say social equality is not to be legislated on, and he doesn't even ask them to, advance the social status. He's just asking them to give the African Americans a fair chance to develop what there is good in him, access to schools, and just free travel, and just not to be molested. That's the point. And so he does pass a very interesting. This is towards the end of his second term when he doesn't have a lot of power anymore because they've lost Congress. He passes in 1875, which it's 150th anniversary on Saturday, March 1st, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It's forgotten because it was repealed in 1883, but I can tell you this, it was incredible. It was the first and only for many years. Many of these laws and acts were the only ones for many years. I mean, for generations that would be enacted by the U.S. government. The Civil Rights Act was a little different because it even went to the point of desegregation, which you wouldn't even hear debated again in U.S. government until the Civil Rights era, 90 years later. It just incredible what he was trying to do, what he was willing to do at that time. Whoops. So there is a period of progress in this time. You have 2,000 African Americans that serve in political positions, including, you can see the first colored senator and representatives in the image to the left, and on the right you have Grant appointing the first African American minister to Haiti, Ebenezer D. Bassett. And again, he said that he calls attention to the newly enfranchised race, to the importance of their striving in every honorable manner to make themselves worthy of their new privilege. And again, that's kind of the theme. He says, you've got this, you've got to lay hold of it, you've got to move forward in your new liberties. But he was fighting against the current. There's a lot of things going on towards the end of his term, a lot of other things. Prejudice is breaking, is still rampant in the North. There's a financial panic in 1893. He loses the midterms, as I said. He doesn't have Congress anymore. He's accused of overreach for his use of federal forces in the South. And he's got factions within his own party that are working against him. And again, what you see in the picture is an image of Grant standing up at the end of his term to horrible, horrible violence and atrocities occurring in Louisiana. And he said it's a deplorable fact that political crimes and murders have been committed in Louisiana and gone unpunished, that they've been justified or apologized for. It's a reproach to the state and the country that will be around long after this generation. So he's making very strong statements using federal force right up to 1876, wherever he can, wherever it's called for, but it is getting more difficult. Even Northerners are getting tired of the Reconstruction. They're becoming apathetic, more and more apathetic towards the future of the African Americans. And so he's got this incredible uh, you know this stuff that he can't surmount. He can't get things done anymore because of it. Now he's always been a proponent of education, Grant has, but certainly in the case of you can see the Straight University students here. He actually stopped at Straight University in 1880. He actually stopped at numerous schools and churches in the South, Deep South, during a tour in 1880 after the end of his presidency. And he said it's a good sign to see this university attended by colored people who were for so long deprived of such advantage. Those who have gone before you had no such advantages. I think that's a powerful statement. But by the gift of these institutions, these here are taking the first great steps towards improving the advantages guaranteed them. So he had some inspiration that things were still progressing, even though there was some struggles going on afterwards. Now, to prove his point, in the 1880s, Grant is going to be living in New York City, and he's got a valet named Harrison Terrell who was born into slavery. And you can see him in the photograph behind General Grant in his last days on the porch of Grant Cottage. And so he's his valet in those last days. Now, before that occurred, when he was still living in New York City, he actually wrote a recommendation for Terrell's son, who was trying to put himself through Harvard. And he said, my special interest in him is that his father is my butler, but he also says that I should feel an interest in any young man, white or colored, who had the courage and ability to graduate himself at Harvard without pecuniary aid other than what he could earn. And so that's, I think, a powerful statement. And Robert ends up going on to become the first African American judge in Washington, D.C. And there's in the Smithsonian, they have his judge's gavel there that you see. So that's again, and his wife was Mary Church Terrell, who was a very well-known early civil rights advocate and also a founding member of the NAACP. So Grant, in looking back on everything, he says that the South, he clearly states that the South, his clear statements about slavery. For one, he says that the cause of the Civil War was slavery. That's in his memoirs, clear as day. There's no room for the lost cause in his memoirs. But he says the former South was burdened with an institution abhorrent to all civilized people not brought up under it, and one which degraded labor, kept it in ignorance, enervated the governing class. And then he says people of the South will wonder how their ancestors ever fought for or justified these institutions with the acknowledged right of property in man. And again, I think he's making a clear statement at that point. And later on, he actually says that his wife, who was brought up with the institution of slavery, eventually came to the point where she understood that there was no real justification. It was it was a horrible thing. But again, she was obviously indoctrinated growing up in it. So Grant is mourned by the African American community when he dies in 1885, and significantly. And he was mourned all across the South. And I think it's very poignant. I like to make this point. There were what they called at the time colored militias, colored bands, black orators, and they went to town squares and they paraded in public and they mourned Grant. They memorialized him and mourned him in the days after his death. Why is that poignant? It's poignant because they wouldn't even have been able to assemble 20 years before. They wouldn't have been able to hold a musket 20 years before. So Grant, you know, them even being able to recognize him and mourn him was part of the freedoms that he helped to establish for them. And I think that's very poignant. Um, there was an emancipation celebration on August 6, 1885, just after Grant's death. It was 35 miles to the east of the Cobblestone Museum in Rochester, New York. And one of the featured speakers was Frederick Douglass. And he is going to eulogize Grant because he had just died. And he says, today we stand, I should say, before we go too much further, Richard T. Greener on there was helped. He was on the Grant. Whoops. Let me get back to this. Okay, there we go. He was actually the first treasurer of the Grant Monument Association to make sure Grant had an actual tomb to rest in by 1897. So back to Frederick Douglass. He says, today we stand in the valley of the shadow of death of USS Grant, the most illustrious warrior and statesman of modern times, the captain whose invincible sword saved the republic from dismemberment, made liberty the law of the land, a man too broad for prejudice, too humane to despise the humblest, too great to be small at any point. In him the Negro found a protector, the Indian a friend, a vanquished foe a brother, an imperiled nation a savior. He was among the first of our generals to see that slavery must perish and the Union might, so that the Union may live, and to protect colored soldiers from insult by a military order. To him, more than any other man, the Negro owes his enfranchisement. In the matter of the protection of the freedmen from violence, his moral courage surpassed that of his party. Hence, his place at its head was given to timid men, and the country was allowed to drift. Instead of stemming the current with stalwart arms, the nation mourns him today, as well it may, for its great loss. Among all the American people, no class will feel the loss by his death more than we, and none will his name be more hallowed and his memory held more precious forever. Now, in terms of the lasting impact, so Grant says before he dies, he says that there may be a conflict between the races that will come up again. But he says that the African Americans were originally brought to these shores not by their own choice, and they should have the rights as any citizens. Obviously, we know a quick synopsis is what Grant established falls apart during the Jim Crow era. These rights are taken away by different measures, including, different ways of disenfranchising, the poll taxes, the intimidation, the lynchings. So this is a terrible period, starting really in the 1890s. It lasted for a little while. But it's important to note that it wasn't gone. They gutted some of these acts, the Klan acts that Grant pushed through during it. They gutted some of this legislation, but some of the most important critical pieces were left in place. They kind of sat there dormant for many years. And so Grant's achievements are forgotten because of that. But some 90 years later, after Grant signed the 15th Amendment, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of it's supposed to be 1964. And in that legislation and the defense of that legislation is used some of the framework that Grant was left over from Grant's administration. And so I think, that really brings it full circle in terms of Grant's effect. And of course, the legislation is still used today. We're hearing about it in the news today, different legislation that occurred during the Grant administration. That's how pivotal his administration was, but especially for civil rights. And Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1962, our truly great presidents were tortured deep in their hearts by the race question. No president can be great or even fit for office if he attempts to accommodate to injustice. And I think that was Grant's evolution. I think he became tortured, and I think he always was to some extent morally uncomfortable with slavery, but it became a thing abhorrent to him. And he says later on that once slavery fired on the flag, it had to die. We could make no peace with slavery. And so why doesn't Grant get the credit that the folks in the 1950s and 60s get? Well, it's a long time before, but the people during his period, they were progressives and elitists, they're called now. They ended up writing a different history, and the Sons of Confederate Veterans wrote a different history, and Grant was not. None of this was highlighted, other than Grant was seen as the idea of corruption and the idea of overusing federal force. But in recent years, I'm happy to say that the reevaluation of Grant has brought out a whole different person that I think some will even go to the point of saying that his career meant more to civil rights than any other American, because as a soldier, he fought to make emancipation real. And then as a president, he continued the fight, and his framework went right into the 20th century to be used in the civil rights period then. So I'll leave you with a statement by Sean Wilentz, who's a professor of history at Princeton. He said, given all that Grant was up against, not simply from Confederates and Southern white terrorists, but as president from high-minded factional opponents and schismatics from his own Republican Party, it is quite remarkable that Grant sustained his commitment to the freedmen for as long and as hard as he did. The evidence clearly shows that he created the most auspicious record on racial equality and civil rights of any president, from Lincoln to Lyndon B. Johnson. And again, some will even claim that in essence he did more and he accomplished more and he realized more than any other individual in our history. And so another big part of it is that in the civil rights era of today, or of the 20th century, that was more of a popular movement, and it was more of a government movement back then. So the government was trying to, move the civil rights needle forward, whereas you had folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and others trying to push it forward from below, I would say, up to government. And so that was a different dynamic as well. But certainly, Grant, the echoes of Grant are in that legislation. So I appreciate your time, and I'm sorry I've gone a little bit long, but I'm certainly willing to stick around if anybody would like to ask some questions for sure.
That's great, Ben. We definitely thank you for your presentation. It was a wonderful opportunity to learn more about U.S. Grant. So, Sue, at this point, if you'd unmute and respond to any questions that have been raised in the chat.
Yes, we have a question from Susan. Susan asks, what is the source of images and information on the Blacks mourning Grant and the Frederick Douglass speech?
So the source of the images on this slide, mainly, well, I wasn't able to explain them all. But the one on the far left with Grant with his hand on an enslaved individual, or a freedman, we'll say, was actually in his original tomb, his first tomb. That was an image done and put in his tomb. So that's how important, the mourning process was. They actually put an image like that, him being the protector, the emancipator, protector of the African Americans. That's what the symbolism is there, and that was in his original tomb. And then you've got an image showing obviously a formerly enslaved individual, mourning. It says our friend on the wreath that he's putting at the monument of Grant. It's a stylized, of course, monument, and then you have African Americans standing just after the turn of the century. Grant's tomb was opened in 1897, which you see in the image, which Richard T. Greener, the first Harvard graduate, Black Harvard graduate who graduated in 1870, became the treasurer for the Grant Monument Association that raised the funds for it. But those are Black individuals there standing and having their photograph taken, I think about 1903. near the tomb. So obviously they had visited the tomb. It meant something to them in that period as well. In terms of the speech of Frederick Douglass, it's available online. It was done on August 6th of 1885, and so the transcript is available online. You can just kind of look it up under that. I think there's a whole page just of Frederick Douglass speeches. And it's much longer. I mean, it's about emancipation mostly because it's the Emancipation Celebration Day, but it definitely took a chunk out of it to recognize Grant because he was being buried in New York City the next day.
Now, with regard to your opening question, asking which president comes to mind with regard to civil rights, we had 4 mentions of LBJ, 2
Yeah.
of Lincoln, and
Yeah.
2 of Grant.
Well, the Grant ones might just be teachers' pets. I don't know, but no, no, but no. And most people they don't immediately think of Grant though, and I think that proves it. That Grant, as I think as a general, he's looked at as an emancipator because he helped, win the war and realize emancipation. But as a president, his civil rights record there is largely forgotten, and thankfully in recent years it's getting more attention. But yeah, I think, and I wouldn't feel guilty about that either. It just hasn't been exposed. Most people have not been exposed to how important Grant was in the progression of civil rights. Most of the things that he did were absolutely unthinkable 20 years before he was president, unfathomable, unattainable. And so he did some incredibly progressive things during his administration. And there was an incredibly lasting effect to it as well, even though some of the gains at the time, there was a golden age. And you say, well, it was a failure. Well, people like Greener, people like, Robert Terrell, people like that had an opportunity to get educated. Even though there was the Jim Crow era coming, they were educated, they were empowered, and they became the future civil rights leaders of the early 20th century. And so he really gave a springboard by creating this period of, political engagement, and education and opportunities that would help springboard the civil rights movement into the 20th century. So I don't think it was an utter failure, as it's said. Grant gets blamed. Why didn't you do more? When Grant was held to an impossible standard as a president, and thankfully people are really just realizing how much he accomplished. Given the complexity of the time in office. Many other things that I can't get into that he had to deal with as the president.
Before you take down your slideshow and we open up microphones if anyone wants to directly ask you a question, did you want to just tell us a little bit more about Grant Cottage?
Yes. Yeah, Grant Cottage is the place that Grant's doctors took him. He was living in New York City, but they took him up to a mountaintop in the foothills of the southern Adirondack Mountains of New York State for the healthier air. They wanted to get him out of the putrid summer air of New York City up to this, healthier place. He was far progressed with throat cancer at the time, unfortunately, but he battled out those last 6 weeks at the cottage. He was working on his memoirs because he lost all his money in a Ponzi scheme in Wall Street, and he was trying to take care of his family before he died. So he's writing his memoirs mostly about the Civil War, and he pushed himself. He couldn't even speak anymore, but he pushed himself to the very final moments before he died to finish that book. And he died there on July 23rd, 1885, surrounded by his family, and he was taken to New York City for his internment. But the house was actually left immediately by the owner as a memorial to Grant, and it survived over 100 years. And all the artifacts, because it was immediately left as a memorial, all the original items from his time there are still in place. It's like a time capsule of history. So, and it happens to be on a beautiful mountaintop with one of the best views of the Upper Hudson Valley. And it's only a short walk from your car. So that's even better. So we have a lot of programming. We operate May through October. Definitely check out our website, grantcottage.org. But I would encourage you to visit. We have guided tours. It's a small but powerful experience to go through the house. I can tell you that.
And those that are wanting to purchase your book, an autographed copy of your book, is that where they can find it? grantcottage.org?
Yes, yeah, we have grantcottage.org. You just go to the shop to support. We have a little online gift shop there with different books and items that you can purchase there. I think we're running a 20% special right now.
Well, there you go.
That's probably advertised on there.
20% off. I think we'll shut your screen down, okay, so that we can see the participants at this point.
Sure.
And we can ask anyone that would like to ask a question directly to Ben can unmute, introduce yourself.
Somebody did put in the chat there, I see, if I know Larry Clowers. Yes, I have met Larry Clowers once. I've met a lot of different he's a grant portrayer. And I have met him once years back. He did a play or some presentation at our site. And so we've had a number of grant impersonators.
I've met Grant at the Tomb a number of years and have spoken there actually as the past national president of the Daughters of the Union Veterans of Civil War. So, and I've also been to the Cottage as well. So it was a privilege to be there, actually. It really was.
Wonderful. Yeah, we always try to have the Sons of Union veterans come up and do a flag ceremony every year.
Yep.
In memorial and the local camp, obviously. And I do a presentation where I talk about as in person as a veteran of the Civil War, talking about the importance of the Grand Army Republic and of course the auxiliary group. So it's definitely something I put a lot of emphasis on for sure.
Anyone else have any comments or questions for Ben?
Well, let me just take this opportunity then. I would like to just publicize our next program. Anyone who's interested in women and the Erie Canal, we have a speaker, Elizabeth Farrell, who is Assistant Director of Education and Public Programming at the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, who will present Waterway of Change, Women in the Erie Canal. It will be held Thursday, March 20th, and it's at 6:30 p.m. The Erie Canal revolutionized upstate New York, bringing new ideas, people, and industries to the region, sparking a firestorm of change. The presentation will cover how the fight for women's rights grew out of the changes brought about by the Erie Canal and the movement's dependence of networks that the canal facilitated. Pat's Auto Repair is the sponsor once again for that program. And if you are interested in that topic, remember it is the bicentennial 200 years for the Erie Canal this year. So it's very timely. You can go to our website and you can register the same way that you did to register for tonight's program if you're interested in that.
Thank you, Susan. This is Karen Cleveland, and I thank you and Douglas for promoting President Grant this evening, and want to just mention that I am also proud of the Cobblestone Society there. I lived on Eagle Harbor Waterport Road for about 10 years. So was a neighbor, and I'm glad to see the society really, going to work for education here in this time. Also commercial, Waterloo. I lived in Waterloo and built a American Civil War memorial there. And Friday, May 24th, we will be having an illumination ceremony giving honor to the Civil War soldiers that actually had joined the service from Waterloo, but also we commemorate the North and the South Confederates as well. So that will start at 8 o'clock if anyone is interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Oh,
Karen.
very good.
Thanks for your information. That's great.
Yep.
Anyone else this evening have anything they'd like to add? If not, we're going to thank Ben Kemp once again for a wonderful program, and thank you all for
Thank you,
attending.
Ben.
Have a safe and
thanks so
blessed
much for everybody
evening
who's
and weekend, and
interested. Yeah.
enjoy your families. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
all yours for now because I cannot.
Looks like we're good.
Okay.
Thank you,
Very
Ben. Very good.
Yes, no, it was my pleasure. Like I said, a little shaky at moments there. First time doing it, so I hope everybody still got. I think there was a little too much material in there. I got to weed it out a little bit, but I appreciate you let me do that, and hopefully folks enjoyed themselves.
Your slides
No
were
problem.
excellent. Yeah.
And I did put in the book recommendation. I looked it up online quickly so I would get the spelling of the author's name correctly. And I put that in the chat. And